The rain fell in sheets, turning the narrow country road into a slick ribbon of asphalt. The windshield wipers of Jake's beat-up pickup truck struggled to keep up with the deluge. He squinted through the glass, the headlights cutting through the darkness just enough to reveal the endless stretch of road ahead. It was late, and he was tired, but the thought of his warm bed at home kept him going. He'd been driving for hours, and the only signs of life he'd seen were the occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse light and the glowing eyes of a deer caught in his high beams. That's when he saw her. A figure stood on the side of the road, her arm outstretched, thumb pointing skyward. Jake slowed the truck, his instincts warring with his better judgment. It was late, and this stretch of road was notorious for being deserted. But something about the way she stood there, drenched and shivering, made him pull over. As he rolled down the window, the cold rain sprayed into the cab. "You need a ride?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. The woman nodded, her pale face barely visible beneath the hood of her soaked jacket. She didn't say a word as she climbed into the passenger seat, her movements slow and deliberate. Jake couldn't help but notice how cold the air in the cab became the moment she sat down. He turned up the heat, but it didn't seem to make a difference. "Where you headed?" he asked, trying to make conversation. She pointed straight ahead, her finger trembling slightly. Jake glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with long dark hair that clung to her face. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were fixed on the road ahead. The drive was silent except for the rhythmic thud of the wipers and the occasional rumble of thunder. Jake tried to shake the unease that had settled over him, but it clung like a second skin. He kept glancing at the woman, half expecting her to say something, but she remained still, her gaze never wavering. Then, just as they rounded a sharp bend in the road, she spoke. "Stop the car." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it sent a chill down Jake's spine. He hesitated, his foot hovering over the brake pedal. "What? Why?" "Stop the car," she repeated, her tone more urgent this time. Jake's heart raced as he pulled over to the side of the road. The rain had let up slightly, but the wind still howled through the trees. He turned to her, his mouth dry. "Is everything okay?" She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out into the storm. Jake watched, stunned, as she walked a few paces down the road before turning to face him. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment he thought he saw something, sadness maybe, or regret. Then, without a word, she vanished. Jake blinked, his mind struggling to process what he'd just seen. He jumped out of the truck, the rain soaking him instantly, and ran to where she'd been standing. But there was no trace of her, no footprints, no sign that she'd ever been there at all. Shaken, he returned to the truck and drove home in silence. That night, he dreamed of the road, of the rain, and of a crash that he couldn't escape. He woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of screeching tires echoing in his ears. The next morning, he went back to the spot where he'd picked her up. There, in the mud, were tire marks, fresh and deep, as if someone had slammed on the brakes. But there was no sign of the woman, no evidence that she'd ever been there. Jake didn't tell anyone about what had happened. Who would believe him? But as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been part of something far beyond his understanding. Word of Jake's encounter spread slowly, like a ripple in a pond. He hadn't meant to tell anyone, but after a few sleepless nights and the recurring dream of the crash, he confided in his best friend, Marcus, over a couple of beers. Marcus, ever the skeptic, laughed it off at first. But when Jake showed him the tire marks on the side of the road, Marcus's laughter died in his throat. "You're telling me you picked up some ghost chick and she just vanished?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I don't know what she was," Jake replied, his voice low. "But she wasn't normal." Marcus didn't say much after that, but Jake noticed the way his friend's eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror as they drove home that night. A week later, Marcus called Jake in the middle of the night, his voice trembling. "I saw her," Marcus said, his words rushed. "I picked her up. She was just standing there, like you said. And then she was gone." Jake's blood ran cold. "Did you dream about the crash?" There was a long pause before Marcus answered. "Yeah, I did. Over the next few months, more stories began to surface. A trucker named Rita claimed she'd picked up the pale hitchhiker on a lonely stretch of highway near the state line. She described the same cold air, the same eerie silence, and the same sudden disappearance. Like Jake and Marcus, she dreamed of a crash, a head-on collision that left her gasping for air in the middle of the night. Then there was Tom, a college student who'd been driving home after a late-night study session. He'd seen the woman standing under a flickering streetlight, her hand outstretched. Against his better judgment, he'd stopped. She climbed into the back seat, her presence sending a chill through the car. When she vanished, Tom had been so shaken that he'd driven straight to the police station. The officers had humored him, but when they checked the spot where he'd picked her up, they found nothing, no footprints, no evidence of anyone being there. The dreams, however, were the one thing all the drivers had in common. Each one described the same scenario: a blinding pair of headlights, the screech of tires, and the sickening crunch of metal. They'd wake up drenched in sweat, their hearts pounding, convinced they'd been in a crash. But there was never any damage to their cars, no injuries, no proof that anything had happened. Jake began to wonder if the woman was some kind of omen, a warning of a crash that was yet to come. He started avoiding the road where he'd first seen her, taking long detours just to stay away. But the dreams didn't stop. If anything, they became more vivid, more real. He could feel the impact, hear the shattering glass, smell the acrid scent of burning rubber. It was as if the crash was imprinted on his mind, playing on a loop. One night, Jake decided to confront his fears. He drove back to the spot where he'd picked up the hitchhiker, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The road was empty, the rain falling in a steady drizzle. He parked on the shoulder and got out, his breath visible in the cold night air. "I don't know who you are," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But if you're trying to tell me something, I'm listening." There was no response, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Jake stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the road remained silent, the darkness pressing in around him. As he drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The rearview mirror showed nothing but empty road, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. When he finally pulled into his driveway, he was exhausted, his mind racing with unanswered questions. That night, he dreamed of the crash again. But this time, something was different. As the headlights bore down on him, he saw the woman's face in the other car. Her eyes were wide with fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. And then, just before impact, she mouthed two words: "Help me." Jake woke with a start, his heart pounding. He knew then that this wasn't over. The woman wasn't just a phantom. She was a message, a plea for help, and he was determined to find out why. Jake couldn't shake the image of the woman's face from his dream. Her wide, terrified eyes haunted him, and the words, "Help me," echoed in his mind like a broken record. He knew he had to do something, but he had no idea where to start. The only clue he had was the stretch of road where he'd first seen her. If he was going to uncover the truth, that's where he needed to begin. The next morning, Jake drove to the local library, determined to dig up any information he could about the road and its history. The librarian, an elderly woman with a kind smile, directed him to the archives. A dusty room filled with old newspapers, maps, and records. Jake spent hours poring over the material, his eyes scanning for anything that might explain the phantom hitchhiker. It wasn't long before he found something. A newspaper article from 10 years ago caught his eye. The headline read, "Fatal Crash Claims Life of Local Woman." Jake's heart raced as he read the details. The article described a head-on collision on the same stretch of road where he'd picked up the hitchhiker. The victim, a 22-year-old woman named Emily Carter, had been driving home from a late shift at a diner when her car was struck by a drunk driver. She had died on impact. Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the grainy photo accompanying the article. It was her, the woman he'd picked up. Her long dark hair, her pale face, her haunting eyes. There was no mistaking it. Emily Carter was the phantom hitchhiker. But why was she still here? Why was she haunting this road, appearing to drivers and leaving them with dreams of crashes? Jake needed answers, and he knew there was only one way to get them. He had to talk to someone who had known Emily. According to the article, Emily had worked at a diner called Rosie's, a small roadside eatery about 20 miles from the crash site. Jake decided to pay the diner a visit. When he arrived, the place was nearly empty, save for a few truckers sitting at the counter and an elderly waitress wiping down tables. Jake approached the waitress, his nerves on edge. "Excuse me," he said, trying to sound casual. "I was wondering if you could tell me about someone who used to work here." Her name was Emily Carter. The waitress froze, her eyes widening. She glanced around nervously before leaning in closer. "Why are you asking about Emily?" she whispered. Jake hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I think I saw her. On the road. I picked her up, but she vanished." The waitress's face paled. "You're not the first," she said, her voice trembling. "Ever since the crash, people have been seeing her. They pick her up, and then she disappears. And they all have the same dream, the crash." Jake's heart pounded. "Do you know why she's doing this? Why she's haunting that road?" The waitress sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Emily was a sweet girl. She didn't deserve what happened to her. That drunk driver, he took everything from her. But he got off scot-free. Walked away without a scratch. Some folks say Emily's still out there because she's looking for justice. Others say she's trying to warn people, to keep them from suffering the same fate." Jake's mind raced. If Emily was seeking justice, maybe there was a way to help her find peace. But how? The drunk driver had walked away from the crash, literally. According to the article, he'd fled the scene and was never caught. The case had gone cold, and Emily's death had been left unresolved. Jake thanked the waitress and left the diner, his thoughts swirling. He needed to find the driver responsible for Emily's death. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead he had. He spent the next few days digging through old police records and talking to locals, trying to piece together what had happened that night. Finally, he found a name, Carl Mitchell. According to a witness who had come forward years after the crash, Carl had been at a bar near the diner that night. He'd been drinking heavily and had bragged about teaching someone a lesson before storming out. The witness had seen him get into his car and speed off in the direction of the crash site. Jake's blood boiled as he read the report. Carl Mitchell had gotten away with murder, and if Emily was still out there, it was because she was waiting for someone to bring him to justice. But Carl Mitchell was nowhere to be found. He disappeared shortly after the crash, leaving no trace. Jake knew it wouldn't be easy to track him down, but he was determined to try. For Emily's sake and for his own peace of mind, he had to find Carl and make him face what he'd done. Jake's search for Carl Mitchell became an obsession. He spent every spare moment scouring public records, social media, and online forums for any hint of the man's whereabouts. He reached out to old acquaintances, bartenders, and even private investigators, but Carl seemed to have vanished into thin air. It was as if he'd never existed. Frustrated but undeterred, Jake decided to expand his search beyond the local area. He drove to neighboring towns, asking questions and showing Carl's photo to anyone who might recognize him. Most people shook their heads, but a few remembered Carl as a troublemaker, a man with a short temper and a penchant for drinking too much. One bartender in a rundown dive bar recalled seeing Carl a few years back, but he hadn't been seen since. He was bad news, the bartender said, wiping down a glass. Always causing fights, always running his mouth. If he's gone, good riddance. Jake's frustration grew with each dead end. He began to wonder if he was chasing a ghost. But then, one evening, he received a break. A private investigator he'd hired called with news. Carl Mitchell had been spotted in a small town about 3 hours away. He was living under a different name, working odd jobs and keeping a low profile. Jake's heart raced as he packed a bag and hit the road. He didn't know what he would do when he found Carl, but he knew he couldn't let him slip away again. The drive felt endless, his mind replaying the dreams of the crash and Emily's pleading face. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him, guiding him. When he arrived in the town, it was late. The streets were quiet, the only sound the hum of streetlights and the occasional bark of a dog. Jake parked his truck and walked to the address the investigator had given him. A rundown motel on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. Jake's stomach churned as he approached the door to room 12. He knocked, his hand trembling. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the door creaked open, revealing a man with unkempt hair and bloodshot eyes. It was Carl Mitchell. "Yeah?" Carl grunted, his voice rough. Jake's jaw tightened. "Carl Mitchell." Carl's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "My name's Jake. I need to talk to you about Emily Carter." Carl's face went pale, and he tried to slam the door shut, but Jake shoved his foot in the way. "You're not running this time," Jake said, his voice low and steady. "You're going to face what you did." Carl stumbled back into the room, his hands raised. I don't know what you're talking about, man. You've got the wrong guy. Jake stepped inside, closing the door behind him. No, I don't. You killed her. You were drunk and you ran her off the road. And then you ran away like a coward. Carl's bravado crumbled. He sank onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. I didn't mean to, he muttered. I didn't mean to hurt her. I lost control. Jake's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. You took her life, Carl. And you've been hiding ever since. But it's over. You're going to turn yourself in. Carl looked up, his eyes filled with fear. I can't go to prison. I can't. You don't have a choice, Jake said. Emily's still out there. She's been haunting that road, waiting for someone to bring you to justice. And I'm not leaving until you face what you've done. Carl stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief. You're crazy, he whispered. She's dead. She's gone. Not to the people who've seen her, Jake said. Not to me. For a long moment, Carl said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he nodded. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, I'll turn myself in. Jake drove Carl to the local police station, his mind racing. He didn't know if this would be enough to bring Emily peace, but it was a start. As Carl confessed to the crime, Jake felt a strange sense of relief. He had done what he could. Now it was up to Emily. Carl Mitchell's confession made headlines. After years of silence, the truth about Emily Carter's death was finally out in the open. Jake watched the news coverage with a mix of satisfaction and unease. He had done what he set out to do, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. Emily's face still haunted his dreams, her whispered plea for help echoing in his mind. A few nights after Carl's arrest, Jake found himself driving down the same stretch of road where he'd first encountered Emily. He didn't know why he was there. Maybe he was hoping for closure, or maybe he just needed to see for himself that she was finally at peace. The road was quiet, the moon casting a pale glow over the asphalt. Jake slowed his truck as he approached the spot where he'd picked her up. And there she was. Emily stood by the side of the road, her pale figure illuminated by the headlights. She looked just as she had the first time he'd seen her, drenched, shivering, her dark hair clinging to her face. Jake pulled over, his heart pounding. He rolled down the window, the cold night air rushing in. Emily, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Thank you, she said softly. You gave me what I needed. Jake swallowed hard. Is it over? Are you at peace now? Emily nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. Almost, but there's one last thing I need to do. Before Jake could ask what she meant, she opened the passenger door and climbed into the truck. The air in the cab grew cold, just as it had the first time, but Jake didn't feel afraid. He felt a strange sense of calm, as if he were exactly where he was supposed to be. Drive, Emily said, her voice steady. Jake didn't question her. He put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the road. They drove in silence, the miles slipping away beneath the tires. Jake kept glancing at Emily, but she stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, Emily spoke again. Stop here. Jake pulled over, his hands trembling on the wheel. They were at the exact spot where the crash had happened 10 years ago. The road was empty, the night still and quiet. Emily turned to him, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. This is where it ends, she said. For both of us. Jake's breath caught in his throat. What do you mean? Emily reached out, her hand hovering just above his. You've done so much for me, Jake, but I can't move on until I face what happened here. And neither can you. Before Jake could respond, the world around him shifted. The road blurred, the night sky twisting into a kaleidoscope of light and shadow. He felt a jolt, as if the truck had been struck by an invisible force. The sound of screeching tires filled his ears, and then impact. Jake's vision went black. When he opened his eyes, he was standing on the side of the road. The truck was gone, and so was Emily. The night was silent, the air still. Jake looked around, his heart racing. He was alone, but something was different. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for months was gone. The dreams of the crash, the haunting image of Emily's face, they were no longer there. It was as if a chapter of his life had been closed, the story finally complete. Jake didn't know how long he stood there, staring at the empty road. Eventually, he turned and began to walk. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. As he walked, he thought he heard a faint whisper on the wind, a voice saying, "Thank you." He turned, but there was no one there. just the road, stretching out into the night. Jake smiled. He knew Emily was finally free,